Hello and welcome to our WPS Audit YouTube video on the topic of sampling during a Medicare cost report audit. Now, first of all, when we talk about a Medicare cost report audit, we could be talking about a variety of different topics. It could be one of these items, it could be multiple items, depending on what a particular provider reports in their cost report. Just a few examples. We have Medicare bad debts, one of the more commonly audited items. We also have total bad debts and charity care, both of which are currently a big part of the worksheet S-10 uncompensated care audits. We also have Medicaid days, total days. These are part of DISH audits. We might have FTEs for interns and residents as part of our medical education audits. We have organs for organ acquisition. And then we might have costs, charges, or statistics for a variety of other reasons. Now, I have a big etc. here because there are a variety of other things that could be audited during a Medicare cost report audit. Really, anything on that cost report is potentially subject to audit. Now, the thing is, with any of these listings, when a provider submits that listing with the cost report, this could include hundreds or even thousands of items, and sometimes several thousand items, depending on the listings. So the question here is, what are we going to review out of that listing? The listing itself serves as a summary that should tie to the cost report amount, but the listing doesn't provide a whole lot of great detail. It doesn't have any support on the listing. It shows us certain day amounts, dollar amounts, patient information, but it doesn't obviously have its own support. We would have to drill down and ask for support for each of those data elements. Now, the goal of any Medicare audit, regardless of what type of audit we're performing, is to, first of all, take a look at the information on the cost report. We're going to scope it based on whatever risk we believe exists. It could be based on a prior year audit, some findings that exist in the prior year. It could be on CMS instructions to the MAC or any other sort of protocol we have in place for risk. Maybe there were major changes from current year to prior year or prior year to current year. Maybe it's just an overly high dollar amount compared to other providers nearby. There are a variety of reasons that it might be scoped, but whatever we identify as needing a review, we then have to gather and review sufficient evidence to support that amount. The idea, the goal overall, is to gain reasonable assurance regarding the accurate reporting of that particular amount, dollar, day, whatever it might be. Now, if it's accurate as reported, then of course no adjustment is needed, but in some cases we may need to make adjustments based on our findings. So that's where we start to talk about evidence. Now, this citation I have here is from CMS Publication 100-06, Chapter 8. And that is referred to as the Financial Management Manual, Section 60.7 specifically. It basically talks about the AICPA auditing fieldwork standards that apply to really any, whether it's a financial statement audit, a cost report audit, but they state that sufficient competent evidential matter is to be obtained through inspection, observation, inquiries, and confirmations. Those are all audit procedures. So those need to be performed to afford a reasonable basis for an opinion regarding the financial statements under examination, or in our case, a properly reported cost report, and our opinion on whether that cost report is reported properly. So we talk about sufficient evidence. That's the first key clause that comes out of that quotation. When we talk about sufficiency, you could talk about the type of evidence, which is outside of the scope of this particular YouTube video, and it will differ quite a bit depending on what type of audit is being performed. So we have the type of evidence, but more importantly for this video, we have the quantity of evidence. So how much is going to be reviewed? We're going to focus on the quantity aspect. Now, the idea here is that we need to have an effective audit. So when the provider submits a cost report to the MAC, the auditor has to perform an effective audit. We need to gain reasonable assurance, but we also have to do it within reasonable time frames. Providers certainly want to receive their reimbursement timely. They want to have that reimbursement reconciled properly and accurately, but it has to be done within a reasonable time frame. Furthermore, we want to make sure we're placing just minimal burden on anybody that's supplying information to us, whether that be you as the provider, whether that be some other third party. We want to make sure to minimize that burden. That's a main goal there. And it's unreasonable to request or even review supporting documentation for every single item on a list of several thousand items. That's just, for both parties, both sides, that's unrealistic. Now, obviously, my little illustration here is a little not realistic anymore. It's a big stack of papers. In this day and age, most everything is electronic, but it just makes a point that at some point it becomes unreasonable for documentation requests. So we want to focus our review on what matters and what can we do to still have an effective audit, yet still be efficient at it and timely at it. So we have CMS Publication 100-06, again, the FMM. This one's section 60.6, and it defines sampling for us. That's one of the solutions to have an effective audit, yet still be efficient. Sampling is the application of an audit procedure to less than 100% of the items within that balance, within that line item, if you will, to evaluate some characteristic of that balance, class, or statistic. So bad debts, for example, we might be looking for a proper write-off date. Is there support for that write-off date? Is there support for that amount? But the key thing is we're not looking at the entire listing necessarily. We're looking at a sample, a selection out of that population, out of that listing, to identify whether or not it appears that they've been handled properly. So instead of reviewing the entire list, we're sampling. However, the key thing here is the auditors must still consider the effects of any errors on the population. So even though they're not reviewing that entire list and every single unit in that population, they have to consider what the errors they found in that sample, what that means for the overall population. Now here's another section out of that 60.6, and it talks about how to use the test results that the auditors find. If the results of testing the sample that was selected using a non-statistical method indicate probable errors in the universe of transactions, entries, statistics, whatever, then document your decision to either expand the sample to see if those errors exist elsewhere, or if it was just an unlucky probe sample that was selected that happened to have a lot of errors. So we can either expand the sample, or the auditors can redesign the sample using a statistical method. We'll talk more about that statistical method in just a bit. If the results of testing the sample that was selected using a statistical method indicate probable errors in the universe, document the decision to project the error to the universe or population. Projection is also known as extrapolation. Basically, that means if there was a 10% error rate found in that sample that was selected, and if it was selected properly, then there's reason to believe there would be a 10% error rate throughout the entire population, and that's the adjustment that will be made, is a 10% error rate for the entire population, not just the sample. Again, the key thing here, the key assumption, is that that was a statistically valid sample to begin with. Now, if the last sentence here, if the adjustment that the auditor is making is only for the errors they have actually identified out of that sample they tested, then they must document the reason for not considering the effect of the errors on the universe. In other words, okay, you did a sample, there was a 10% error rate found in that sample. Why do you not think there would be a 10% error rate in the entire population? Why is an adjustment not being made to that extent? So that's the thing, and this documentation, if that happens, it would have to show that there was no or little risk of errors being in the entire population. So generally speaking, if we have a statistically valid sample, absent evidence to the contrary of no risk for the rest of the population, then we would be projecting that error rate to the population, extrapolating. That's some evaluation techniques that can be used by the auditor. If there was low risk, so if you took a look at the listing and maybe it's a low dollar amount, maybe it's around the same as last year that had also been audited, then if there's low risk, then a judgmental or non-statistical sample might be selected. Maybe that's what the auditor chooses. In that case, if it stays at a judgmental sample, then only the specific errors that they note are going to be adjusted. There would not be any extrapolation or projection of those error rates. It would just be the direct errors out of that sample. Now, if a high error rate was found during that judgmental sample, then as we said in that last section, that last slide, the auditor either has to expand their judgmental sample to further assess risk, or they have to resample using a statistically valid sample, which would lead to extrapolation and projection of the error rates, again, in most cases. Now, one of the things I will mention about this, when the auditor starts off with a judgmental sample and then they have to convert it to a statistically valid sample, in some cases, those units that they selected to begin with may not even be able to be used. As we're going to see in a bit, a statistically valid sample has to be random. That's the first key thing with a statistically valid sample. So maybe they chose item 10, 15, and 30. If 10, 15, and 30 do not show up in the randomly selected sample, then they don't need that information from the first group. So that's one thing to keep in mind there. It's a new sample altogether. Now, there is one exception I want to mention. It kind of goes back to these first two bullet points. Even though with a judgmental sample, we don't extrapolate or project any error rates because it would not be supported, if there is a situation where there were pervasive errors found throughout the entire listing, and or maybe some other reason to believe that the listing is just absolutely unauditable, unreliable, in those situations, there might be a documentation type adjustment where the entire amount is disallowed due to lack of documentation altogether. Now, if they did a test, and let's say they found one of those units to be properly supported, but nothing else appeared to be, then of course we'll allow that one that was properly supported, but everything else in the dollar amount or the day amount on that cost report line would be disallowed. Now again, that's not an extrapolation, it's not a sampling adjustment, that would be a documentation type adjustment. So let's go to the next bullet point. If the high risk was assessed initially, then the auditor might actually start with a statistically valid sample. Let's say it was just a very, very high error rate, or high error rate that was found in the prior year, for example, or a very high dollar amount compared to national averages, maybe a large change over the prior year. In those cases, they may not even mess with a judgmental sample. They may start with a statistically valid sample to begin with. Now, this is another excerpt from 60.6, talking about the non-statistical and statistical approaches. Either one is fine to start with, but the key thing here, a non-statistical sample may support acceptance of findings. So if that was a probe sample and the auditor looked at 5 or 10 units and they did not find any error rates or no issues that were concerning, that may be enough to accept that the listing was correct. But if there were errors noted, then again, if it's a judgmental sample, the only thing they can do at that time is adjust what they found. They cannot extrapolate from a non-statistical sample. Instead, those findings have to be scientifically established to support adjustments. Now, by scientifically established, we're saying either they directly tested that unit and can certainly adjust that unit, or it's been a statistically valid sample that's been projected to the population. That is also a scientific establishment for the adjustment. And of course, we're focusing mostly on the statistical sampling in this video. Now, the next discussion when we talk about risk and these listings is that in some of these cases, the dollar amounts or the day counts or whatever we're talking about may be highly variable. So there might be a very large listing and a lot of units are on the small side, but then a lot of units are on the high side. They're all across the board. Or there may also be reasons that are obvious by looking at the listing that, hey, some of these units are this type of bad debt, for example. Some other units are a completely different type of bad debt. Now, this is not a bad debt YouTube video, but just one example, one easy example would be what's called a crossover or dual eligible bad debt. There are certain requirements for those types of bad debts to be allowable, and there are certain pieces of evidence that would be required just for those types of bad debt, but that would not be required for a traditional bad debt. On the other hand, traditional bad debts have additional requirements that would be needed. So these have different risks. These two different types of bad debts, they have different risks of missing documentation. So it might make more sense to stratify those listings and look at the dual eligible bad debts separate from the non-dual eligible bad debts. That way when we do extrapolate, it's only being extrapolated to that subpopulation rather than the entire listing. Now, the other thing you'll see is if something's reported on a different line of the cost report, then that would generally lead to stratification as well. So the goal of stratification is to focus in on the risk and also potentially reduce the sample size, make for a more efficient audit while still being effective. So the key thing is if a stratification takes place, we broke one list up into two separate listings, for example, any error rate we find in listing 1 will only be extrapolated to the entire listing 1. So in other words, any error rate we find in a sample of listing 1 will only be extrapolated to the entire listing 1, not the overall listing of everything. Now, another important thing about any sort of item that's being audited when we're taking a look at these listings to determine whether or not an auditor is going to sample it is the importance of clean listings to begin with. Now, generally, whether it is with the S10 audits or any other audits, the auditors are going to review that listing, they're going to scan that listing, and try to find any obvious errors up front before they start the sampling, because it's much easier and more effective to eliminate those obvious errors that you don't even need detailed support for. It's much better to eliminate those up front, or perhaps they may request that you, the provider, submit a revised listing after cleaning it up, after they've pointed certain errors out to you. So that's the perfect world, is that a clean listing would come in, or at least there are no obvious errors, and then we can use that to select a sample to review in more detail for things that you can't obviously identify based on a listing. Just an example going back to bad debts. Bad debts are only allowed in the cost reporting period that matches the write-off date. In other words, if the write-off date was 12/10 of 2020 and it's a 12/20 cost report, or it's 12/31/20 cost report, then that bad debt would only be allowed in that 2020 cost report. It could not be reported earlier. It could not be reported later. So if the auditor is going through that listing and they see write-off dates that are 6 months into the next year, then obviously that's not going to be allowed. So they could bring that to your attention. They can try to get that listing cleaned up before they do the sampling. Now, if they're able to find that there are obvious pervasive errors, if they find that up front, again, they may request a clean listing to be submitted. However, the key thing here is that this can only be done up front. Once they start selecting the sample and testing that sample, generally there are not going to be new lists allowed. So any chance to clean up that listing would take place before the sampling starts. And part of the reason for this is simply that they've already engaged in the testing, they've already requested documentation, time has already passed. That sample is now what's going to be used. Once the sample is selected, it's locked in, and it would actually be inappropriate to select a different sample. It would actually violate the whole randomness provision of statistical sampling if the auditor, for whatever reason, their own reason or at the behest of the provider, if they selected a new sample, then it would really invalidate the entire sample to begin with. So that's why once a sample is selected, it's locked in. Now, it can be expanded, but it can't be completely restarted. So the entire sample would be selected and documented, and then any sort of error rate that is found from the review of that sample would be extrapolated to that population or stratum, depending on the review. Now, one thing that often comes up from providers is the question of why we're looking at a relatively small number of units compared to 10,000 units on the listing, for example. And that is the nature of sampling. The nature of any audit is that nobody is looking for absolute assurance of perfection. That's not how audits are designed, whether it be a financial statement audit, a cost report audit, a tax audit. You're generally not looking for absolute assurance. Instead, what's usually required is reasonable assurance as to the proper amount being reported. It all boils down to costs versus benefits and the whole issue of timeliness, as we said before. So we talked about sufficient evidence. That's required. That's, of course, subject to judgment. We talked about quantity versus type of evidence, efficiency versus effectiveness, and the goal overall is to justify the listing as it is or have the basis for a defensible adjustment to correct the listing, specifically to correct the cost report. Now, when we start talking about statistical sampling theory, it relies on two concepts. First of all, the laws of probability. That tells auditors which units to test, which ones are selected. And as I mentioned, it has to be random, or really with financial statement audits and anything computer-based, it's actually called pseudo-random because it's a computer algorithm that is certainly beyond the auditor's judgment, so it's random enough for these sampling techniques. And then we have statistical theory, which tells us how many we should test. And the idea here is that we want a sample that's large enough to be representative of that entire listing, quantity-wise and hopefully quality-wise as well. So we're not going to focus on the randomness because that's, again, just computer-generated, no main issues there. But it's statistical theory we're going to focus on here for just a little bit. And the idea is that the auditor needs to find a representative sample based on predetermined degrees of reliability. And the whole idea is that that sample, whether it be 5, 10, 100 units, should be representative of what that auditor would likely find if they tested 100% of the population. But again, there's no way to know for sure what that would be because they're not going to be testing 100% of the population of a multi-thousand line listing. Auditing and statistical sampling in general is a science of estimation, not exactitude. It's never intended to be exact. There is risk built in, but it's a reasonable and acceptable risk. Now, I do want to mention just one thing. This is not maybe so relevant for providers, but there are two different types of sampling that could be done potentially in a Medicare audit. One is called attribute sampling, which is mostly for internal controls. It's basically a pass-fail type thing. Either the unit is acceptable or it's not acceptable. There's no half of it's right, half of it's wrong. Attribute sampling is not commonly done in Medicare audit. There are only a few situations where that comes up. But variable sampling is what Medicare auditors use quite a bit. And the idea here is that, for example, a bad debt that was reported at $5,000, maybe the real amount should have been $3,500. The overall unit is fine, it's just the amount is wrong. Attribute sampling would not allow a situation like that. Variable sampling, you can test a lot of different things about that unit, and maybe part of it's allowable, part of it's not. So they're weighted values, that's the key thing. Now, when we talk a little bit about the design of the variable sample from an audit perspective, there are two basic things that come into play in determining the desired level of accuracy and assurance that's provided by that auditor in their testing. These two terms are known as the precision level, also known as the margin of error, or the confidence interval. They work hand in hand with one another. Now, these are all estimates of risk. The idea is that sampling risk, again, it does exist. And the sampling risk is the risk that if whatever we find, whatever the auditor finds during their testing after projection and extrapolation, whatever that adjusted amount is, if it was off of what the quote-unquote true amount was, had they tested all 10,000 of those units, again, that's not known because nobody is testing those 10,000 units, but the goal is to be within a certain percentage of that true amount, had they known what the amount was. Now, this is all statistical sampling. It's all used in many different fields. It's not just Medicare audit by any means. But with precision level, the goal is to identify how precise the auditor needs to be. Again, these are all pre-established in many cases. So how precise do they need to be? What leeway are they willing to allow? And the idea here is that if there's an X% precision level, then the adjusted amount is going to fall within plus or minus X% of the true amount. Again, quote unquote true. That's the precision level. And the idea here is the smaller this precision level, or the tighter is what it's referred to as, then that requires a larger and larger sample to get that accurate plus or minus of the true amount. So that's the thing about a precision level. A confidence interval works with the precision level. It's how sure does the auditor need to be that the estimate, the adjusted amount, falls within plus or minus the precision level from the midpoint. The inverse of this confidence interval is basically the allowable risk that we're not as precise as we needed to be. So an example of this would be a Y% confidence level. The auditor is Y% sure that the adjusted amount is within plus or minus X%, which was the precision level of the true amount. So let's just say that was, I'm going to throw out a very, very tight one. Let's say it was 10%. Let's say this precision level was 10%. That's a very tight precision level that's generally not used by any sort of auditor. So it would be very tight. You're within plus or minus 10% of the true amount. And how confident are they that they're within that range? That's the confidence interval. Maybe that's a 90% or 95% or whatever. They're that sure that they're within that distance of the true amount. So that's what that boils down to. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention, I touched on this earlier, but once a sample has been started and once the testing has begun, the auditor has to stick with that sample. They may expand it. They may get a larger sample. They have to keep with the units they've tested, and they can test more if the sampling program requires a larger number to still be statistically valid. But they cannot resample to try to get a different result. They can't say, yeah, we tested these, we found a lot of errors, but let's start over and see if we find a list with fewer errors. They cannot do that. It would be invalid at that point. So we've had requests from providers from time to time asking us to do that, thinking that, hey, we just picked a bad, an unlucky sample, if you will, but that's not allowable. We have to stick with the sample that was selected and what the adjustments were. No reopenings will be allowed based on a revised listing that's intended to overturn the sampled results. Again, the idea here is that the listing should have been clean when submitted, and if nothing else, during the audit, the clean listing should have been submitted. But once an extrapolation has taken place, we cannot reopen that to correct for those types of issues. We can't resample at that point. So that's the finality of it. Now, I just wanted to briefly mention that whole issue of expanding the sample. Within the audit sample selection tool, there's something known as a seed number that basically tells us where we left off in the algorithm. And when you plug the seed number back into that tool, it can continue where the tool left off. So if the first 10 units were selected, but then the tool says, hey, you really need a larger sample size to support these findings, the auditor can keep those original 10, and it may tell them they need another 10. So now you have a total of 20 units. That might very well happen. That's perfectly allowable. To prevent multiple requests for documentation, in some cases the auditor might select those spares up front. They may or may not need to test them, but it would save you time from having to submit documentation a second time. Now, that they may not need to expand. They may even need to expand further a third round. So that's just an issue that would come up as the audit progresses. So that takes us through the statistical sampling audit discussion here. Hopefully this has helped from a provider perspective as well as an auditor perspective. But certainly, if you have any questions on the sampling methodology that's used, you could ask the auditor that is working on that unit, and they should be able to explain some of those items for you. So I thank you for your time, and hopefully this has been helpful. Have a great day.